Urban legends that turned out to be true.
Let's start in New York City, with a story almost everyone has heard in some form. Alligators living in the sewers. The legend says they're pale and blind from decades in the dark, feeding on rats, waiting just beneath the manhole covers. For most of the last century, people treated this as a joke, something teenagers made up to scare each other. But on February 9th, 1935, a group of boys in East Harlem were shoveling snow into a storm drain when one of them saw something moving in the water below. He wasn't imagining it. Down in that sewer was a live alligator, about 8 feet long and 125 pounds. The boys looped a clothesline around it and hauled it out onto the street, and when it snapped at them, they killed it with their shovels. The New York Times ran the story the next morning, and at least 2 other newspapers covered it independently. Nobody knows for sure how it got there. The leading theory is that it escaped from a passing ship or was dumped by someone who bought it as a pet, since baby alligators were sold in stores and by mail order back then for less than $2. There's no evidence of a breeding population living down there today, but that one alligator was real. It was pulled out of a real sewer, and it's the reason this legend has never fully gone away.
Next, a story that isn't about a monster at all. It's about a woman. For decades, kids passed around the idea of a person who could make you sick just by being near them. Someone who spread disease without ever getting sick themselves. It sounds like something out of a horror movie, but it's based on a real woman named Mary Mallon, better known as Typhoid Mary. She was an Irish immigrant working as a cook for wealthy families in New York in the early 1900s. Wherever she worked, people around her started getting sick with typhoid fever. She herself never showed a single symptom. In 1907, a sanitary engineer named George Soper traced the outbreaks back to her and discovered something medicine hadn't fully understood before, that a person could carry a deadly bacteria inside them their whole life and never once get sick from it. Mary refused to believe it and refused to stop working as a cook. She was eventually forced into isolation on an island in the East River, released years later on the promise she'd never cook again, and then caught working under a fake name after another outbreak broke out. She spent the last 23 years of her life confined, and by the time she died in 1938, health officials had identified more than 400 other silent carriers just like her. Most were never locked away. Only Mary was. This next one happened in a hospital, and it's one of the strangest medical mysteries on record. On the night of February 19th, 1994, a 31-year-old woman named Gloria Ramirez was rushed into the emergency room at Riverside General Hospital in California. She was suffering from late-stage cervical cancer and was barely conscious. As the medical staff tried to save her, they noticed something odd, an oily sheen on her skin and a strange garlicky smell coming from her body. Within minutes, nurses and doctors around her began collapsing. Some fainted outright. Others felt muscle spasms and struggled to breathe. By the end of the night, 23 hospital workers had gotten sick. 5 were hospitalized, and 1 nurse ended up in intensive care for 2 weeks with lasting health problems. Gloria died 45 minutes after arriving. Her body was so alarming that a hazmat team had to move it, and she was buried in a sealed metal casket. Investigators ran one of the largest forensic examinations in California history trying to figure out what happened. They found unusual chemical compounds in her blood, possibly related to home remedies she'd been using for her cancer symptoms, but no theory has ever fully explained what made an entire emergency room collapse around her. The official cause of her own death was kidney failure from the cancer. What actually poisoned the room around her has never been solved. Every city has some version of the story about a boogeyman who steals children. On Staten Island in the 1970s, that boogeyman had a name: Cropsey. Kids said he was an escaped mental patient hiding in the ruins of an old institution, waiting to snatch children who wandered too close. Parents used it to keep their kids away from the abandoned buildings scattered across the island. Then, in the 1980s, children on Staten Island actually started disappearing.
When a young girl with Down syndrome named Jennifer Schweiger vanished in 1987, she was later found buried on the grounds of the old Willowbrook State School, the very institution the legend was built around. Police arrested a man named Andre Rand, who had worked as a custodian there and had a documented history of trying to lure children, including once driving 11 kids off in a school bus without permission. He was convicted of kidnapping in connection with Jennifer's death and remains a suspect in several other disappearances from that era, though he was never charged with murder. The story that Staten Island parents used to scare their kids for decades turned out to describe a real man who really was out there.
Not far from Staten Island, in the woods of Fairfax County, Virginia, there's a legend about a man in a rabbit costume who attacks people with an axe near a place locals call the Bunnyman Bridge. Generations of teenagers have driven out there on Halloween, daring each other to see him. For a long time, historians assumed the whole thing was invented, since nobody could find any record of it happening at that bridge. But a local archivist named Brian Conley spent nearly a decade digging through old police files and found something real, just not exactly where everyone thought. In October of 1970, an Air Force cadet named Robert Bennett and his fiancée were parked in a field a few miles from the bridge when a man in a white suit with long rabbit ears ran up to their car, screamed that they were trespassing, and threw a hatchet through the window. 10 days later, a security guard reported a similar encounter with a man in a bunny costume nearby. Police investigated both incidents, but never identified the man. The legend moved the story to the bridge over the decades and added murders that never happened. But the man in the rabbit suit and the hatchet through a real car window were confirmed by 2 separate police reports.
This next legend usually gets told as a ghost story about a bridge collapse, but it starts with something people swore they saw in the sky. Starting in November of 1966, residents around Point Pleasant, West Virginia began reporting a tall, winged creature with glowing red eyes near an old munitions site outside town. Witnesses described it as roughly 7 feet tall, capable of flying alongside their cars at speeds over 100 miles an hour. The local paper ran the story, and soon people all over the region were calling in sightings. The press started calling it the Mothman. For over a year, the sightings continued. Then, on December 15th, 1967, during evening rush hour, the Silver Bridge connecting Point Pleasant to Ohio suddenly collapsed into the river below. Dozens of cars went down with it. 46 people died. In the aftermath, several witnesses claimed they'd seen the creature on or near the bridge in the days before it fell. Engineers later determined the real cause was a tiny crack in a single steel eye-bar, a flaw invisible to any routine inspection. There's no official link between the sightings and the collapse, but after that December night, Mothman sightings in Point Pleasant almost completely stopped, and nobody has ever explained what those dozens of witnesses saw in the year leading up to the disaster.
Every parent has heard the warning about poisoned Halloween candy. The idea that a stranger might slip razor blades or drugs into a kid's trick-or-treat bag. For decades, this was treated as pure urban legend, something exaggerated by paranoid parents. And for the most part, it is exaggerated. But there was one real case, and it's more disturbing than the legend itself. On Halloween night in 1974, an 8-year-old boy named Timothy in Deer Park, Texas, died after eating a piece of candy called a pixie sticks that had been laced with cyanide. Investigators eventually discovered that the poison hadn't come from a stranger at all. It came from Timothy's own father, Ronald Clark O'Brien, who was deep in debt and had recently taken out life insurance policies on his children. O'Brien had gone to a chemical supply store days earlier trying to buy potassium cyanide. He handed poisoned candy not just to his own son, but to 4 other children that night, apparently to make the murder look random. None of the other children ate theirs in time. O'Brien was convicted and executed in 1984. He is the reason the phrase "check your kid's candy" became a Halloween tradition. Even though decades later, his case remains the only confirmed instance of a child being killed by poisoned trick-or-treat candy from that era.
Long before any of these, there's a story from the Kansas prairie that reads like something out of a horror film, except it happened in 1873. A family calling themselves the Benders ran a small inn and grocery store along a well-traveled trail, offering food and a place to rest for passing travelers. Locals eventually realized that men who stopped at the Bender place kept vanishing without a trace. When neighbors finally searched the property that spring, they found the true horror hidden underneath it. At least 11 bodies were buried in the garden and orchard, their skulls smashed in, their throats cut. Investigators pieced together how it worked. A guest would sit at a table with his back to a canvas curtain, while the family's daughter, Kate, charmed him with conversation or a psychic reading. Behind the curtain, her father and brother would strike him in the head with a hammer, then drop his body through a trapdoor into the cellar to finish him off. By the time anyone figured out what was happening, the entire family had vanished. A nationwide manhunt and a large reward never turned up a confirmed capture. To this day, nobody knows for certain what happened to the bloody Benders. Some say they were caught and killed
quietly by a vigilante posse. Others believe they simply disappeared into new identities and were never seen again. For over 65 years, a small boy in Philadelphia was known only by a description: the boy in the box. His body was discovered in February of 1957, wrapped in a blanket and left in a cardboard box in a wooded area of the city. He'd been beaten to death, and no missing person report anywhere matched him. Detectives circulated flyers with his photograph across the country. Thousands of tips came in over the decades and led nowhere. He became something of a local legend, a nameless child buried in a potter's field under a headstone that simply read, "America's Unknown Child." Investigators exhumed his body twice, trying to pull usable DNA, and in 2019, they finally succeeded, using forensic genetic genealogy, the same science that's cracked so many cold cases in recent years. On December 8th, 2022, 65 years after he was found, Philadelphia police announced his identity. His name was Joseph Augustus Zarelli, born in 1953 and only 4 years old when he was killed. His parents were both already deceased, and to this day, no one has been charged with his murder. The mystery of who he was is finally solved. Long Island has its own haunted house story, and most people know it from the movies. A family driven out of their new home after just 28 days by demonic voices and levitating beds. What gets left out of the retellings is the real crime that made the house infamous in the first place. On the night of November 13th, 1974, a 23-year-old man named Ronald DeFeo Jr. shot and killed 6 members of his own family as they slept in their home at 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville, New York, his parents and 4 younger siblings, using a rifle while they lay in their beds. He initially told police it was a mob hit, but confessed within a day, later claiming he'd heard voices telling him to do it. He was convicted of second-degree murder. A little over a year later, a new family moved into the same house and lasted less than a month before fleeing, claiming they'd experienced a terrifying paranormal presence, which became the basis for the famous book and film. Skeptics have long argued that haunting was exaggerated or invented entirely to sell a story. But the murders that gave the house its reputation were never in question. 6 real people died in that house on a single night, at the hands of someone who was supposed to protect them. We'll end with one that still doesn't have an ending. In January of 1959, 9 experienced hikers set out on a ski trek through Russia's Ural Mountains. When they failed to check in as planned, a search party went looking and eventually found their tent cut open from the inside, with the hikers' footprints leading away from it into the snow, some of them without shoes. The first bodies were found under a tree near the remains of a small fire, dressed in only their underwear despite sub-zero temperatures. As more bodies turned up over the following weeks, the injuries got harder to explain. Some had fatal skull and chest fractures with no external wounds, the kind of trauma you'd expect from a car crash, not a fall. 2 were missing their eyes. 1 had no tongue. Traces of radiation were found on some of their clothing. Soviet investigators closed the case by blaming an unnamed compelling natural force,
and never explained the specifics. For 60 years, theories ranged from secret weapons testing to infrasound-induced panic to simple hypothermia-driven confusion. In 2019, Russian authorities reopened the case, and in the years since, several teams of scientists have proposed a rare kind of slab avalanche as the most likely explanation, one triggered slowly by wind-driven snow rather than a sudden collapse. It's the closest thing to a scientific answer this case has ever had, but it still doesn't explain everything
Investigators found in the snow that year, and the Dyatlov Pass incident remains one of the most disputed, unsolved mysteries in modern history. 11 stories, 11 legends that most people assumed were exaggerated, made up, or flat out fake. And every single one of them turned out to have something true buried underneath it. A real alligator, a real killer, a real bridge, a real family that vanished without a trace. Maybe that's the real lesson here. The next time somebody tells you a story is too strange to be believed, it might be worth checking the newspaper archive before you write it off.